I've always felt that football was pretty closely related to warfare. It's not such a frightening concept. I mean, violence is certainly a part of man, so why not admit it? Use it. Let it out. That's what football is. Controlled combat, civilized combat. Of course, violence isn't all there is to football. The game is a great training process for citizenship. Discipline, teamwork, responsibility. It's full of good old-fashioned American values. But the violence is definitely there. Violence is a big part of the game. And why not? As long as men enjoy this violence, and it looks as if they always will, then I certainly think football is the ideal way to go about it. One thing should be made very clear. The game of football did not originate at the University of Notre Dame. It only seems that way. As a matter of fact, football didn't originate in the United States. Like so many of the best things in America, it began with people from other lands, in other cultures, in other times. It's hard to think of football as being Greek or Danish or Roman or Chinese, but you know it has been. Before the time of Christ, the ancient Greeks were playing a kind of football called Harpastum. They didn't use anything like the Rose Bowl gridiron, but they did have rectangular fields, and they marked their sidelines and had goals. The Romans picked up the game from the Greeks, and when Julius Caesar conquered the British Isles, his soldiers taught the game to the natives. Some people claim that was the beginning of the Fighting Irish, but it's only a legend. Basically, the game consisted of a group of men kicking around objects just for the heck of it, just for the fun of it. But it wasn't always a ball, as we now know it to be. It seems some Englishmen dug up an old Danish cemetery and started booting a skull around. After they got tired of denting their toes, they used the inflated bladder of a cow. Next step was the original pigskin, just exactly that. Stuffed with hair or cloth, easy to kick. Primitive. So was the game, of course. And by the 12th century, it was England's roughest and most popular pastime. In those days, the game was played in the streets. The object was to kick the ball through the center of town. But the players seemed to concentrate at times on kicking each other. It was half game, half mob, half riot. And even spectating was a dangerous occupation. Things got so bad, the game was banned from the streets. It had to be played outside the towns in vacant areas. A few years ago, in Italy, people recreated medieval football. The stunt was a big success, except they should have worn the armor where it was needed, on the field. In England, King Henry II finally banned football completely. Anyone discovered playing the game automatically went to prison. Probably the toughest football penalty ever imposed. Illegal or not, football fortunately stayed alive, and by the 17th century, it was back for good. Slightly more civilized now, played mostly by young students in secondary schools, with as many players as there were boys. One of the early variations was this wall game. Object, kick the ball. That's what football was for the most part, a kicking game. Heads and shoulders allowed, but no hands. Then in 1823, at the famous Rugby school, a boy named Willy Ellis decided he'd had enough of just plain kicking. Contrary to all the rules of the day, young Mr. Ellis picked up the ball and ran for the goal, thus starting the game of rugby. There would be two kinds of English football now. Soccer, mainly a kicking game, and rugby, which also allowed players to carry the ball and run for a score, and permitted opponents to stop them. Both rugby and soccer developed their own associations, their own sets of rulings, and like most British games, both were really played for keeps. This British enthusiasm for football has carried over into the present. Today, soccer commands the largest audience of any sport in the United Kingdom, and refined though it may be, it's still played with that 12th century enthusiasm. The British are famous as a nation of traders, and they've exported their football to many, many lands, each of which seems to lend the game a flavor of its own. The Italians, for instance, pursue their brand of soccer with a special flair. In New Zealand, the Maori soccer players have added a few pre-game touches that are strictly domestic, sort of a South Sea Charleston. The Russians play soccer too, and they're good at it. When it comes to genuine enthusiasm, probably no country in the world surpasses Australia. Australian football is a rugby variety, and our friends from down under play it well and constantly. Football is played, and weather is certainly no object. I've always said there's no substitute for spirit. They may not be clean, but they're happy. Yet, to a lover of soccer or rugby, say the average Englishman, our kind of football, the familiar Saturday afternoon variety, is almost totally incomprehensible. The object of all football is the same. Move the ball down the field and score. But the rules of American football, the tactics, even the names of the players and their positions, these are strangely unlike any other brand of football. What we take for granted at a college football game is something that's evolved into a genuine American article. A game where the emphasis is on tactics and strategy, not just force and speed. Each time the ball is snapped, those players know exactly what their mission is. There's a thought-out quality, a quality of design, overall plans of offense and defense. And these are truly American characteristics. But none of that just happened. American football evolved slowly, changing out of the imagination of the people who came into the game, players and coaches. It's awfully hard to say just exactly when it all began, but there is one date we do have, a day that marked the start of intercollegiate football. November 6, 1869, the first formal game between two colleges, Princeton versus Rutgers. The winner? Rutgers, 6-4. Of course, there'd been football in America before this. Kicking, running, pushing. I guess boys have always done that. In Boston, it was called the Boston game, and it had a rugby flavor. However, soccer was more popular. By the 1870s, Princeton and Yale began to compete. Columbia and Cornell followed. They too used a form of soccer, and they invited Harvard to join in. But Harvard had played the Boston game and wanted to play that style of football. So for them, the answer was McGill University of Montreal and the famous series of 1874, the series that decided the direction of American football. If not for those Canadians, I might have spent many years coaching soccer instead of our kind of football. But luckily, McGill played rugby, and by the last game, Harvard was completely sold. Drop kicks, running, lateral passing, this was much better, a new kind of football. More exciting, more fun. And it didn't take Harvard long to spread the word. By the next year, 2,000 people paid 50 cents apiece to watch Harvard play Yale its way and win by 4 goals. More schools quickly adopted this new brand of football. And in 1876, the first Intercollegiate Association was born. The game they settled on grew from both kinds of football, but the emphasis was strongly on rugby. All the basic elements were there now: kicking, running, and tossing. There was even a hero. His name, Walter Camp, a freshman on the Yale varsity of 1876. In years to come, he would be called the father of the game. In the 70s and 80s, football spread to new schools. With each new team came new ideas, changing football, moving it away from rugby, giving it a character of its own. The scrimmage, possession of the ball going to a specific side, thus making it possible for both sides to plan ahead. Then came numerical scoring, making so many points equal to a goal. This was football, growing, evolving, and rough. In those days, the most polite word for football was carnage. Straight arms, flying wedges, flying tackles, mass formations. It was a violence in which the players reveled, parents averted their eyes, and moralists shook their heads. Too many teams were concentrating on violence at the expense of sportsmanship. And by 1900, public sentiment was turning against football. In one season, 1905, the casualty list was put at 18 players dead, over 100 seriously injured. Theodore Roosevelt called the situation a disgrace. But rather than abolish football, he tried to save it. His suggestion? Change the rules. On January 12, 1906, the Intercollegiate Rules Committee came together to make football safer, faster, and more interesting. That was really a busy day. Playing time was reduced to 60 minutes and divided into halves. Also, a neutral zone was established to keep the teams at least this far away from each other at every scrimmage, the length of a football. But the most important thing to emerge that day was something else, something called the forward pass. It was legalized to keep men from destroying themselves in close formation, and it became the greatest single offensive weapon football has ever known.
All right, Collins, you and Colrick will play the ends. And the same backfield, Jimmy, you and Collins, Chevney, and Nieming. Now, the success of any team, men, based on team play. Same as we've shown all year. Sacrifice, unselfish sacrifice. These are the fellows they say are pretty good, but I think we're better. And I think if we get ourselves keyed up to a point where we're confident of that, why, the results will take care of themselves. All right, now in the kickoff, if we receive, the little men drop back on the receiver and block long. I don't Notre Dame style. And if we kick off, where the rest of these teams walk, let's run down fast. Just as fast as you can run. And then we go on defense. And on defense, I want the center in and out of that line according to the situation. Use your old head. And I want you guards charging through as far as you can go on every play. Expect to play right over you every time. And the tackles, I want you to go in 1.5 yards and then check yourself. Spread your feet, squat down low, and be ready with your hands and elbows so you won't be sideswiped. But I want the ends in there fast every play, but under control. And you men in the backfield there, I want you to analyze before you move. And if they throw a forward pass, wait till you see the ball in the air, and then go and get it. And when we get it, boys, that's when we go on offense. That's when we go to. And don't forget we're going to pick it on one tackle they've got this week. We're going inside them. We're going outside them. Inside them and outside them. And when we get them on the run once, we're going to keep them on the run. And we're not going to pass unless our secondary comes up too close. But don't forget, man, we're going to get them on the run. We're going to go. And we aren't going to stop until we go to that goal line. And don't forget, man, today's the day we're going to win. They can't lick us. And from the left out of the goal, the first whistle of the man win there. Fight. What do you say, man? Hey.
Football is people. That's the commodity in which a coach deals. It's human nature. And I don't think there's ever been a greater judge of human nature than Knute Rockne. It would take hours to adequately describe that great man. Of course, he was a great coach, but he taught much more than just football. 4 years with Rock, and you had enough values, really, to last a lifetime. From Walter Camp on up, football had captured the interest and the imagination of some fine, outstanding gentlemen, including one man who was almost too good to be true, Mr. Amos Alonzo Stagg. Soon after graduation from Yale, Mr. Stagg became head football coach at the University of Chicago, a post he held for 41 years. Young, middle-aged, right to the end, he was one of football's most inventive coaches. An offensive genius, always plastic, always ready to change. His ends back formation was the cornerstone of mass football. Yet, in 1906, Stagg was one of the first to take advantage of the newly legalized forward pass rule. Chicago attempted 64 pass plays that season. Players and coaches came into the game and left it. Yet, Amos Alonzo Stagg went on. At the age of 70, Mr. Stagg departed the University of Chicago. But instead of retiring like the average man, he moved across the country to little-known College of the Pacific and started a whole new career. Under his guidance, COP became known from coast to coast. In 1943, at the age of 81, Mr. Stagg was voted Coach of the Year by his fellow coaches.
Uncle Sam has been very good to me by sending a lot of good football players to the College of the Pacific, and I've done my best to develop them into a team and unify them and make them as skillful as possible and as effective as they have been. Is that all right?
Mr. Stagg died only recently. He was 104. The way I remember the gentleman best was at a birthday luncheon several years ago. He just turned 95, and he concluded his speech that afternoon by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, in case you wonder what I'll be doing during the next several years, it gives me great pleasure to inform you that I'm going to continue doing the rest of my life what I've done all my life, work with the youth of our nation." Another famous coach on offense was Mr. Fielding Yost of Michigan. Hurry Up Yost, they called him, and for good reasons, too. In one 2-year period, his Wolverines averaged a point a minute, some 60 points a game. His first year at Michigan was 19-1. That team was the most potent powerhouse football had ever known. By the end of the season, not one single point had been scored against it. On January 1, 1902, Yost's Wolverines came west to meet an unbeaten team from Stanford University. The postseason game was held in Pasadena. It was the first Rose Bowl game, and it was a real slaughter. Michigan 49, Stanford 0. Then along came Mr. Pop Warner, one of football's most brilliant minds. In 1895, at Georgia, he started a coaching career that spanned 41 active years. By the turn of the century, he was head coach and athletic director at Carlisle, a government Indian school in Pennsylvania, coaching a fantastic youngster who could do absolutely no wrong on a football field. His name, Jim Thorpe. Suddenly, little-known Carlisle started knocking off athletic joints like Harvard, and Glenn Warner became the most famous coach of his day. Pop Warner invented the single wing, famous for its power and in sweeps to the strong side. When the defense caught up with the single wing, Coach Warner's fine imagination enabled him to give birth to the double wing formation, from which he ran reverses and fake reverses without the loss of pure power. Like Mr. Stagg, Pop Warner became a legend in his own time. The legend lives on today, with thousands of boys learning football in the Pop Warner leagues all across our wonderful land. Another innovator was Bob Zupke of Illinois. Zup was called the Little Dutchman. He came to Illinois in 1914 and is famed for at least 2 achievements. Though others have laid claim to it, Zupke was first to employ a huddle to call plays. This was way back in 1921. And in 1923, the most famous player he ever produced, the incredible Red Grange. No player of the time was more deserving of publicity than Harold Red Grange of Illinois. The newspapers christened him the Galloping Ghost. Red Grange earned all the praise he got. He was one of the greatest football players that ever came along. In 1913, Notre Dame was practically unknown. They played football all right, but so did other schools, bigger ones. Still, in 1913, Notre Dame had a quarterback named Gus DeRay and an end named Knute Rockne. In the fall, Notre Dame went up the Hudson to play West Point for the first time. The Army expected a soft touch. After 60 wild minutes of football, the score was Notre Dame 35, Army 13. Thanks to Rockne and DeRay, the forward pass had finally arrived. Rock was a brilliant student, and after graduation, he taught science for a year at Notre Dame. But by 1915, he was an assistant coach, and 3 years later became head football coach at his alma mater. Soon, football was reacting to a Knute Rockne refinement, the Notre Dame shift, a rhythmic move from the regular T into a box formation. The effect was to throw the opposing line off balance, confuse them, not let them know where the attack was coming from or where to defend. Opposing coaches called it absolutely outrageous, unfair. Pop Warner called it the chorus line. In 1922, the 4 horsemen, quarterback Harry Stuhldreher, fullback Elmer Layden, left halfback Jim Crowley, right halfback Don Miller, captured the public's imagination. That was one of the finest teams ever blended together. They were called Rockne's Ramblers, and in 1924 were untied, undefeated. They met Pop Warner's champs from Stanford University and won the game 27-10. In Notre Dame's one and only trip to a postseason game, the Rose Bowl. In the last half of the 20s, Boys from all over the country were eager to matriculate at the University of Notre Dame, including a rather undistinguished tackle named Francis William Leahy.
Get that tackle alone. McMahon, you use the camel block on the guard. And Metzger, you pull out and use the rolling block in the center. You plug the gap there, Tom. And Cochran, you trail the center from behind here. You start along the line of scrimmage here, Leahy, so he can't come through for the secondary. You go right through for the secondary right away. Square, angle play. All right, Crispin, here's the defensive fullback. Got that all clear, man? All set? All right, let's go here.
Rock was fantastic on the practice field. He could be extremely complimentary, and 10 seconds later, he'd be saying the most sarcastic, cutting words I'd ever heard.
Hey. I guess that fellow didn't know who you were. All Indiana halfback. Well, next time he comes by, he won't dare run by. Let's just show him your clippings. Let's try that again and see if you can't do something. All right, come on, let's go here. All right, let's try it again. Come on, baby. All right, see you show some now. Put that stuff on reel. Let's go here.
Signal. 89, 42, 21. Hip.
1, 2, 3.
Hip.
All right, come on, baby. Get up, come on. Oh, that's the way. That's the way to get him. Now, that's something like it. All right, now we're getting warmed up here.
Fortunately, he was a great psychologist. He knew just exactly when to criticize and when to encourage.
And then when we were playing, let's have a lot of fun out of it. Let's come out here and enjoy it. I want you to play football because you like it. If there's any fellow here who doesn't like football, I want him to turn in the suit and get away because he's wasting his time. Well, let's try 92 here.
Signal. 86, 94, 51. Hip. 1, 2, 3. Hip.
One low. Oh, too high, Metzger, too high. And you didn't get that man out there, Leahy. Get your head on the inside of him, Frank. Carry him out.
1928 was Rock's worst season. But in 1929 and 30, Notre Dame was back in stride. Once again, the Fighting Irish were unbeatable. Yet, what didn't happen on the gridiron was taking place in the Rules Committee. For bit by bit, the powers that be were attempting to destroy the Notre Dame ship, and Rock didn't like it.
Without the shift, we would never have had the 4 horsemen in football. They averaged in weight 157 pounds. The shift enabled them to use their speed and their intelligence and their ability to finesse the other fella. Now they're legislating against the shift. They're talking about momentum. But every year they want to slow the shift up slower and slower and slower, which in my opinion is absolutely ridiculous. Whether the referee counts 6 or whether he counts 20, the question simmers down to this. Is there any unfair advantage? And in my opinion, if a shifting team stops for 1 second, that's long enough for anybody except the stupid defensive team, and football wasn't made for any defensive teams. However, if they abolish the shift, I'll change my type of player from the intelligent, smart, trim ankles player that's a 4 horseman, and I'll go in for the cow-minded, hippopotamus chassis type that so many schools use now. And so when you see a football picture of the Notre Dame team about 4 years from now, you will notice the bovine expressions and the ox-knuckle ankles predominating. And the fellow with the mustache doing his best to exude an aroma of strategic cunning, that'll be me.
Though none of us would have believed it, 1930 was to be Rock's last season. Within weeks after the final game, Knute Rockne was dead, victim of an airplane accident. He was barely 42 years of age. Of course, there were other coaches. In the 30s, football was being played by more and more schools. There was the Iron Major, Frank Cavanaugh, who left his mark on 3 great schools, Boston College, Dartmouth, and Fordham. From Michigan, another great offensive coach, Fritz Chrysler. He served a long apprenticeship, 8 years with Alonzo Stagg, and he learned his lessons well. At Minnesota, Coach Bernie Bierman with 4 national championship teams to his credit. This was football at its best in the 30s, but there was a coach who thought it could be improved. His name was Clark Shaughnessy. Thanks to him, the modern T formation came into college football. Even while Shaughnessy was still head coach at Chicago University, he worked constantly with the coaching staff of the Chicago Bears professional football team, helping them refine their tee attack. In the 30s, the Bears had improved their tee by adding the man in motion. That moving man opened up the enemy's defense. He was a decoy or a pass target. But either way, the opponent had to spread in order to cover him. When Shaughnessy went west, the tee went with him. The year before, Stanford had been unable to win a single conference game. But in 1940, they had the modern tee formation. Shaughnessy really built a machine. His Stanford backfield was comprised of Frankie Albert at quarterback, Pete Kometovic at one halfback, Hugh Gallarno at the other, and Norm Standley at fullback. He was a great one. He weighed close to 200 pounds and could run like a scared deer. This was football at its very best, changing, improving. Like everything else, the modern tee was just the bright man taking something good and making it better, a great deal better. In his own way, Shaughnessy's innovation was just as revolutionary as the forward pass more than 30 years before. With the forward pass, football had begun to grow up. With the modern tee, football had really come of age. The last of the war years, the greatest football power in America was Army, a fantastically strong team headed by an outstanding coach, Earl Blake. In 1944 and 45, helped by such outstanding young men as Glenn Davis and Doc Blanchard, Army's teams were absolutely unstoppable for one long stretch from 1943 to 1950. The teams of Earl Blake were beaten only 3 times. A fantastic record. Another school was flourishing now, a real giant, coached by an intelligent man who knew his subject thoroughly, Bud Wilkinson and his powerhouse from Oklahoma. The Sooners began making football history in 1948, and for the next 8 seasons, they had some great football teams. Wilkinson's strong point at Oklahoma was offense. He adopted his own brand of the split tee, backed it up with talent like Jim Owen, Darrell Royal, Leon Heath, and Billy Vessels. In his best 8 years, Wilkinson churned out All-Americans as if they were cornflakes and amassed a remarkable record. Only 6 games lost, 2 tied, and 77 victories. And at South Bend, Ara Parsegian has placed Notre Dame back on top, and I'm not surprised. He's a leader, a natural. He's got it all. And I think he'll go down in history as one of the outstanding college football coaches. You know, when an architect builds a house, he's got a house to show for it. Same with a writer in a book, a bricklayer with a wall, a merchant with a store. But when a football game is over, or a season for that matter, the only tangible things a coach has to show for his efforts are a few lines in a record book and a lot of memories, some pleasant, some sad. And that's quite enough, actually. The satisfaction of building good teams and good men is a more than adequate reward for any coach. And that's what coaches are remembered for. They're good teams and they're outstanding men. On January, and concentrates on the city of Pasadena, California, in the Tournament of Roses. It began as a festival of flowers, but through the years, the Rose Parade has become the prelude for a contest of a very different variety. The football festival called the Rose Bowl game. After Michigan's visit of 1902, it took the West Coast 14 long years to recover. But by 1916, this postseason classic was once again being held between Eastern and Western champions. In 1923, the Rose Bowl Stadium was built, a showcase for modern football. And on its turf, some years later, there took place one of the real nightmares of all football, the wrong-way run of Roy Riegels. Georgia Tech and Cal were struggling desperately in the 1929 game. Then in the second period, Cal's fine center, Roy Riegels, recovered a fumble and streaked towards the goal line. His own, that is. Had it not been for teammate Benny Lom, Riegels would have gone all the way for Georgia Tech. That just wasn't Cal's day. Georgia Tech finally won 8-7. Some 10 years later, another unforgettable moment. The Trojans of Howard Jones were very much the underdogs against unbeaten, untied, unscored upon Duke University. In the last few moments, Duke leading 3-0, an obscure quarterback from USC named Doyle Nave suddenly began to pass with deadly accuracy. He completed 4 consecutive passes. This last one gave Southern California the victory, 7-3. Usually, the patrons leave the rough stuff to the players, but every once in a while, they just can't resist getting involved. It's one thing to let off steam after a game, yet one memorable afternoon, there was a certain fan who just couldn't wait for the final gun. Here was Tom Harmon dashing down the field for his 3rd touchdown of the day. 11 men had failed to stop him. Yet one spirited anti-Michigan rooter decided he'd give it a try. And he came just as close as anyone else. That's what I call real guts. As you look back over the years, you can always pick out some of the outstanding squads. Before the turn of the century, there were Harvard, Yale, Princeton. In the early 1900s, the great Michigan teams of Fielding Yost. In the teens and 20s, Carlisle, Cornell, Pittsburgh, and Georgia Tech. And, of course, Notre Dame. In the years of the Four Horsemen, Rockne's men played the best football in the land. There were other fine teams in the 20s. Andy Smith's wonder teams from California. Then, in the late 30s, Michigan, featuring Tom Harmon, was once again in high gear. In football, no one man wins alone, and Harmon would be the first to remind us of teammates like Forrest Evashevsky, Bob Westfall, Ed Frutig, Al Wistert, and Elmer Madar. Yet Harmon was certainly the star. And here in his final game against Ohio State, we see the style and the speed that made him so famous. There were several powerhouses in 1940, Boston College, Tennessee, Nebraska, and Stanford. Shown here is the Rose Bowl game of January 1, 1941. How about that blocking? The essence of offensive football. I'm not sure where card stunts first originated. Some people claim it was UCLA or USC. I do remember them from my playing days when we traveled to Los Angeles for the Southern California game of 1928. They were just great then, and they're even better now. It's the spectacle, of course. That's part of the mass appeal. On any given Saturday afternoon, you get thrills, Good, loud music, marching bands, and pretty girls. No wonder football's so popular. In 1946, Army was a top-ranking team again. And when they met the Irish of Notre Dame in Yankee Stadium, 85,000 people were on hand to watch it happen. This was probably the most publicized game in the history of college football. All afternoon it went back and forth. Neither side was able to score. And what a game. Blanchard, Davis, and quarterback Arnold Tucker performed most creditably for Army. For Notre Dame, Blue Jack and all his teammates gave an excellent performance. Sitko, a true All-American, put in a full afternoon. A tough afternoon. Two giants coming together, and both playing for keeps. This was rock'em, sock'em football at its very best. If one were to pick a typical great team of the 50s, the nod would probably go to Oklahoma. Squads like Oklahoma, Texas, and Michigan State typified the decade. Agility, power, modern tactics. This was football in the 50s. Someone once described football as a kind of great big public chess game, and I agree. Certainly a coach is a chess player. He confuses, he attacks, he deceives, and if he thinks harder than his opponent, he often wins. Only coaches use people for chessmen, live people, and there's the key to the whole thing, those boys. In a very real way, they're a coach's greatest achievement. That's always been the case. The score certainly counts, but when it's all over, the boys count much more. Over the years, the game of football has managed to absorb many improvements. It seems there's always someone around who can think up some fanciful way to make the game even more interesting. And the ladies of Uppsala College were no exception. Football? Football, a man's game? Nonsense. They'd show 'em, and they did. Not bad. Somehow, though, they never made the Rose Bowl. On any given Saturday in the fall, the game is played in hundreds of stadiums. These playing fields are football magnets, attracting untold hundreds of thousands of people who travel miles to cheer their favorite team. College football owed much of its fame to sports reporters, and none is more revered than Arch Ward of the Chicago Tribune. Arch had a wonderful dream. The finest college players of each season playing the champions of the professional league. At first, it seemed like a wild sort of an idea, but after that first collision in 1934, the annual All-Star Game has become a football classic, a charity event that has featured the game's greatest stars. In 1947, we had the privilege of coaching the All-Stars against the champion Chicago Bears. We won 16-0. The man who plays football has a peculiar kind of courage. I don't just mean physical courage either. In football, you really play yourself. You test yourself all the time. And the athlete who becomes a champion is often the boy who was never quite satisfied. You know, this is what they wore at Notre Dame about 50 years ago when football was still very much in its infancy. And this is what a sports writer friend called the armor of the modern gladiator. It's beautifully designed, but it's only a package. Inside, you still have to pour an old-fashioned boy, someone who's willing to work awfully hard, be a real champion. To crown these men, Walter Camp had coined the phrase All-American, and each year helped select a team of college champions. In the years before World War I, there was perhaps no better publicized player than the All-American Indian from Carlisle, Jim Thorpe. Not only an Olympic and football hero, Thorpe won his letter in baseball and went on to play professionally. In 1925, Ernie Nevers was one of the great performers, an outstanding fullback from Stanford. In the early 30s, there was Jay Berwanger, the one-man team from Chicago. Sammy Baugh, of course. He was much more than just a great forward passer. Baugh was an accomplished football player in every department. Whizzer White from Colorado, superb football player, All-American, All-Pro, and he hasn't done badly since. First a Rhodes Scholar, and now a justice on the Supreme Court. We were playing Southern Methodist University in the Cotton Bowl in 1949. But half the time it seemed as though we were just playing Kyle Rote. So many good boys, and so many schools. One of the best ever to represent Princeton University, Dick Kazmaier. And he was a Tiger, too. There was Ernie Davis from Syracuse University, unanimous All-American halfback. He had such a promising professional career ahead of him, but he was struck down by leukemia soon after graduation, a tragic loss. Notre Dame's John Hewitt was one of professional football's highest-paid bonus babies. His last college game was against Southern California in the fall of 1964. Notre Dame entered the contest unbeaten, a single triumph away from becoming national champion. At the end of the first half, the great passing combination of Hewitt to Snow had vaulted Notre Dame into a 17-0 lead. Yet, after halftime, Johnny McKay's Trojans came back like tigers, and Notre Dame found itself defending, but not attacking. In the last quarter, what had seemed a certain victory was slipping away. It was one of those times when a football coach wished he'd gone into a nice, quiet business like lion taming. In the last few moments of the game, a classic forward pass by USC, and for Notre Dame, the nightmare of sudden defeat. Quite a game, football. It is just a game, at least I know it's supposed to be, but of course it's been a lot more than that to me. When I look back, I figure I've been a pretty lucky Irishman. Football's given me a great life. I can't think of how the years could have made me any happier, at least not in the things that count. True, I worked very hard at football, but I always tried to remember what Coach Rockne used to say. Football is fun, and winning in football, that's the most fun of all.